So we're now opening session 2 of the symposium, titled Review and Refinement of the Fundamentals of Radiological Protection. I and Carla Petrova, on behalf of HRCA, are moderating this session, and I'll ask Carla to introduce the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Chris. Oh, no, it is not. So, thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. So, we will start with this first session, or second session now, and it's my pleasure to invite, to give a first presentation in this session. I am inviting Werner Riem. It's an easy job now because it's not necessary to introduce Werner. And he will give us a presentation with the title, Plans for a Review and Revision of the System of Radiological Protection. Please, Werner.
Well, I'm very sorry, it's me again. Thanks for joining the second session of this morning. And now we are more closer to our topic, the plans of the ICRP for review and revision of the system of radiological protection. I already mentioned it a little bit in my introduction, but now this is the topic actually of the symposium, so I would like to give you some more details. Well, I want to highlight again that we from the ICRP, we consider this project as one big project to review the system, and it's a joint project. And I mentioned this and I want to highlight this and stress it again. So for us, it's a project we should all do jointly together. We all, as we sit here in this room, participating in the symposium, but also those who are not here. So we would like to engage with all the institutions, and I should mention ANSCARE, for example, at the very beginning, the United Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, who look at the science, and of course the basis, what we are doing as ICRP is reading the reports of ANSCARE. But there are other major players like the agency, for example, like ICRP, like HRCA. There are many others, and I already showed you the list of organizations we are in close contact with, and maybe I show it again. I just forgot, to be honest. Yes, here they are. So these are 30 institutions. I think it's too small for you because there are too many already, but they are on the website. And we are in close contact with them. And if there is any other organization interested in radiological protection, which is not yet there, please let us know, and we try to reach out and discuss with them how we could do this jointly together, this big project. Now, keeping the recommendations fit for purpose. I have mentioned in the introduction, and I will talk a bit more on that, we have already published some reflections. This paper, Keeping the ICRP Recommendations Fit for Purpose, reflects the ideas of the previous main commission. I mentioned that last year the new term of ICRP started, but already the previous main commission thought about the review of the system, about areas, whether there are any areas that would require review. And this includes, for example, really basic ideas, basic reflections on the objectives and principles of the system. Overarching considerations are also included, like education and training, communication, and those things. Dosimetry, the paper also discusses effects and risks. And it's an open access paper. Once again, this is on purpose to allow everyone who is interested to read the paper and to stimulate the discussion. And the twin paper, the second paper published, is on areas of research to support the system of radiological protection. The idea is, as this process will take a while, we may even benefit from current research in our efforts to revise the system. And this includes research to support radiation risk assessment, which is central, of course, but there are others to support dosimetry, for example. Research to support the application, implementation of the system. And again, it's an open access paper. If you have not yet done so, please download it, start reading. And again, it was meant to stimulate the discussion in the international community on the process. And we already got first feedback. The digital workshop last year, actually we were meant to come to Vancouver for the symposium last year, but it was not possible due to the pandemic. So instead, we decided to organize a digital workshop. And at least my personal view is that this was quite an attractive program which was offered there, with 20 live presentations and almost 50 on-demand presentations on the various aspects: the big picture, risks and effects, RP concepts and applications and practice. And we had almost 1,500 registrations from almost 100 countries. This already reflects that the international community is interested in this process. And for example, the on-demand presentations were viewed or visited more than 7,000 times. So it was only a digital workshop. There was no face-to-face communication possible, but at least we could reach out to many more people than would have been possible with the face-to-face meetings. And there was opportunity to communicate. The platform supported, for example, chat functions, possibility of video calls among the various participants. So given that it was only digital, we think it was quite a success. And we summarized the major outcomes, the major feedback we heard, the major take-home messages for the ICRP, and summarized this in another open access paper on the key points: the scientific basis of the system, the concepts of the system, the application of the system, and also the role of the ICRP among the other international organizations. This was also addressed quite often. So as I said, an open access paper again, and basically this is feedback on our first paper, paper number 1 on the fit for purpose paper. These are the task groups, and some of them already address major or basic topics, building blocks, if you recall how we call them. And this is the same list again, but now those task groups highlighted were probably essential work for the future, for the next set of recommendations is being done. And this includes, I don't want to read all of them, but this will include TG91 on low dose and low dose rate exposures. This includes task groups on computational phantoms, mesh type phantoms, for example. This includes non-human biotar, for example, 99 reference animals and plants, monographs, ethical considerations, some basic issues like individual response to radiation, what is the scientific basis available so far, and some more fundamental issues like, for example, TG114, reasonableness and tolerability, and many others. And you see that the last 2, 3, 6, 7 were just, I think, decided during the last year and this year. Offspring and next generations, also a very important topic, which is important for many, many people. Detriment calculation for cancer, classification of radiation-induced effect. Is it still fit for purpose? And part of the scientific evidence that we distinguish in the system between stochastic effects and tissue reactions, for example. The principle of justification, and so on and so forth. So there are many topics which we already address. And this is in part at least because we got this feedback already from the international community. So this already reflects in part at least what we learned at the digital workshop last year. So we really listen very carefully what we get as feedback from you and from the international community, and we try to translate this into the work of ICRP. For example, all the major take-home messages we learned last year, they are now transferred to the task groups, to all of the task groups, to make sure that those topics are adequately addressed. I give you one example how we envisage in the future to work together with the community. This is an example, just 2 examples. I will just mention 2 examples here due to lack of time. This is TG121, which is on effects of ionizing radiation exposure in offspring and next generation. This is one of those rather new task groups. And they had their kickoff meeting actually just a couple of months ago. They organized a workshop in parallel, or not in parallel, before their kickoff. And they included 4 major topics in the workshop: hereditary and epigenetic effects due to exposure of germ cell line, which means preconceptional exposures. The second, effects arising from exposure on the embryo and fetus, post-conceptional exposures, transgenerational effects in biota, and this is also important, the last one, potential impact on the system of radiological protection. So we have, from the beginning, we want to think also about potential implications on the system. And as I mentioned, we try to reach out to the international organizations, and this was, for example, this was organized at the European ERPA conference, or in conjunction with the European ERPA conference in Hungary, in Budapest, Hungary, earlier this year. And this was organized together with the European Radiation Protection Research Platforms, Melody, which is on low-dose research, and Alliance, which is on radioecology. So this is one example how we try to do that together, jointly together. Remember, jointly is the word here. And the second example is the most recent task group, task group 127, on exposure situations and categories of exposure. And this shows another example. I would like to highlight and emphasize that we would like to organize the whole process very transparently and open, and jointly, as I mentioned. And transparent means that we, since this year, I think it was since this year, that we issue open calls for membership. If we are going to launch a new task group, then there will be an open call for membership on the website. And in this specific case, we give, of course, information on the terms of reference. For example, in this case, to review 103, and subsequent publication in terms of exposure situations and categories of exposure, because the task group is on exposure situations. And the experience learned after they have been introduced in publication 103, to organize workshops together with international organizations, another element to be open, transparent, and also to make sure that this is a joint effort, so open workshops to be organized, and with special, in this case, with special attention paid on existing exposure situations. So this call is open, and if you are interested, or if you know someone who could be interested, the call is open until beginning of December, 2nd of December, and based on the pool of applications, we will then select, based on the expertise actually, that's the number one, we will select the task group membership. So this shows how we try to engage with all the organizations. We will try to be as transparent as possible and engage with others as much as we can to make sure that this is a joint project and that in the end, let's say in 10 years from now on, we will have a product not where everyone is happy. I think this is impossible, but at least a product which in the end can be applied, can be communicated, is simple enough, yeah, and in the end is used all over the world. And with this, I would like to finish my presentation, my introduction, and my hope is that during this symposium, we get a lot of food for thought, additional food for thought, that we can later translate into the work of our task groups, future task groups maybe, and then in the end come out with the final product. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Werner. I think we will go through all presentation in this session, and at the end we will have, hopefully, some time for the questions and answers. So now I am inviting to give us the second presentation, Bernard Le Guen, President of IRPA. The title of presentation is Views of the Radiation Protection Profession on Refinement of the System. Please, Bernard.
Thank you. So, thank you for this kind invitation. My presentation is not my presentation, it's on behalf of IRPA. And first of all, I would like also to thank Sigurdo Magnusson, Claire-Louise Chapelle. This is my dream team, and we will prepare this presentation all together. You know quite well this slide about IRPA, why we work on this field. IRPA has enormous knowledge and experience based on the practitioner, so the voice of professionals. And this is why we try, when we apply the radiation protection system, to have also the feedback on our day-to-day life. And that's also why when we decided to design the IRPA priorities for the current term, as a first action to contribute radiation protection professional perspective to the revision of the system of radiological protection. And we launched a specific TG in order to coordinate all IRPA efforts. So this TG on the review of the system of radiological protection, but not only, we have several TG related to radiation protection system, so possibilities of a workshop and or webinar and so on related to this revision. It's not new. I would like just to mention, in 2015, we launched a survey, a large consultation with all associated society on the broad effectiveness of the radiation protection system and its ability to be widely communicated and understood by interested parties. And perhaps some of you were in Cape Town in 2016, where we have a fruitful discussion and a real need for a greater visibility of the decision making processes to reach a reasonable level of protection, keeping optimization principles, so ALARA, as a cornerstone of the radiation protection system. And in 2018, we have the opportunity to publish a first paper, IRPA consultation, is the system of protection fit for purpose and can it be readily communicated, view of the radiation protection professionals. Well, one of the key issues to emerge from the 2015 consultation was reasonableness in optimization. We have the opportunity to organize 3 IRPA workshops in cooperation with the French Society, and also one in coordination with ICRP, specifically on the medical field, and also to propose a second paper in 2020 after consultation of all associated society. We have this paper published and is in free access, IRPA perspective on reasonableness in the optimization of radiation protection. Both of all these IRPA initiatives are important input to the revision of the RP system, providing the perspective of the professionals who have to live with the system. That's why now you understand that when ICRP decided to launch this new initiative on the review of the system of radiological protection, we decided to create a mirror task group with Sigurdur as the chair and Claire-Louise and I as the vice chair. It's a large task group because we have around 30 members from 20 associated societies, representing thousands of RP professionals from all regions of the world. We were quite active during the last year because our first task was in July when we decided to provide the first feedback on the ICRP paper Fit for Purpose that Werner well explained a few minutes ago. And we have the occasion to present this first feedback at the ICRP workshop on the future of radiological protection. Then we have the opportunity to continue to work on this field and to propose a revised feedback. And we presented this second revised feedback during the first IRPA North American Regional Congress in St. Louis, Missouri. But what we observed, we have a lot common, but it was, well, not really, it's more intellectual than very practical. That's why we ask to have specific example in order to help ICRP to well explain what is the difficulties or how we can try to ameliorate, to find a solution when it's too complex for the users. And in July 2022, we have the occasion to present this first, the third revised feedback during the annual HPS meeting in Spokane. And this month, I have the occasion to be first in Africa for the African Regional Congress. Then just 10 days ago, I was in Chile for the Latin American countries and Caribbean countries. And I have the occasion to discuss and also to have the feedback. And for example, because I have no time, it was quite interesting to note the difficulties in Africa with the current system and to say, please don't try to move too much because our first priority is to be sure that the current system is applied in our countries. Well, 4 key topics are having broad support emerged from this revised review from the IS: general issue around the system, optimization reasonableness, third, individual risk assessment, and exposure situation. Of course, there are other issues, but they are the most important topics. About the general issue, definitively, the initial review confirms that the radiation protection system and its application in the regulatory framework is robust and fit for purpose, but has become overly complex and conservative. The main concern of the profession refer to its application in the regulatory framework and the resulting challenge to its communication both with professionals and public due to its complexity. Well, a strong ethic basis for the ERP system is strongly supported. As you know, the ERP system appeals to a balance of benefit over harm, to the reasonableness of measure to avoid harm, and to the tolerability of harm. So this clearly indicates complex ethical judgment. That's why there was a mini report about the fact that ICRP should consider how the WHO definition of health can be incorporated into the ERP system. As you know, probably this definition, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And clearly, the conclusion about this is there is a challenge for elaborating practical guidance adapted to specific exposure situations, which must incorporate the ethical values in the decision-making processes for tolerability and reasonableness. Well, about example, challenges due conservative application of the ERP system include practical application of ALARA, clearance, legacy site, use of lead aprons, and shielding assessment. There is a need for a proper regulatory mechanism through which the case for reasonableness can push back against over-conservatism and properly hold it to account for the decision it can drive. Another important point, there are situations where radiation exposure is a major concern, but judgment of justification are not straightforward. Just 2 examples. One is well-known, situations such as decision for evacuation of elderly people and patients after the Fukushima accident, or another example, use of non-medical human imaging. About optimization reasonableness, what is important, there is a strong support for a holistic approach. So recommendation to stress that optimization is not minimization, promote use of reasonable caution, avoiding undue conservatism, and include non-radiation effects in risk-benefit consideration. So practical recommendations for a holistic approach to optimization are needed. About LNT, of course, almost of all associated societies support continued use of LNT as a pragmatic conservative approach for managing, while recognizing uncertainties and challenges at low dose. And the question is, of course, there is a concern that the LNT approach leads to unreasonable financial burden and effort at low doses. Also question about environment, but I have no time for that. Well, about risk, those risks and ethics, there is a need to review how risk is defined due to multiple considerations in definition of the detriment. There is a broad support for introducing age and gender-specific weighting factors in effective dose calculation, but there is also a need to address ethical and practical difficulties in implementation of individual risk estimate in the regulatory framework. Of course, as we have today, adoption of the safe system at low dose, which protects everybody, contributes to reduce inequities. About exposure situation, before to conclude, there is a need for further guidance and clarification of the 3 types of exposure situation and their applications, since many exposure scenarios do not fit neatly into one of these, particularly about the transition between exposure situation. Also, question around concept of limit, reference levels, and constraints in different exposure situations needs also for further guidance. And just to finish, it's very important also to not question around the idea to compare adequately chemical and radiation exposure. More consideration of the combined effect of radiological and chemical exposure should be provided, especially at low doses. So in conclusion, the top priority from the associated society are reasonableness and tolerability in the system, ethics of radiological protection in medicine and more generally, application of the principle of justification, communication, particularly with the public, exposure situation and category of exposure, impact of uncertainty on system of radiation protection and use of LNT, and I did not have time for that, but of course, training of education, that's why we launched an initiative around culture, radiation protection culture. So thank you to ICRP. IRPA welcomes the inclusive approach taken by ICRP, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to continue the discussion in Orlando during the IRPA 16 International Congress. Thank you for your attention. Good. Yeah. Very good.
Thank you very much, Bernard. I think it's very important to know this, the view of, let's say, end users of the system, and I believe it will be taken into account. So now I am inviting for taking the floor Nina Koromnier from Sweden. Nina is head of Swedish Radiation Protection Authority, and Nina is also current head of HERCA, which is Association of European Regulators in Radiation Protection. So Nina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla, and hello everybody. I'm very pleased to be here to speak on behalf of HERCA. And as Carla already mentioned, my day job otherwise is to be the Director General of the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority, SSM. Let's see. So I will just start with a brief introduction to what HERCA is. HERCA is a voluntary organization constituting of 55 competent authorities from European countries in the field of radiation protection. So we're bringing together the regulatory perspective, and we have members in 32 European countries, which means that we have both EU and non-EU countries in our organization. And so the regulatory perspective will be the main thrust of what I'm going to talk about today. since the ICRP general recommendations are the fundament of the legislation, both in the global context through the IAEA standards to regional and national legislation, they are very important to us. So we started our work by identifying areas of particular interest to us as regulators in 2021, and we then continued to elaborate these into a new paper that was launched in May 2022. It's sort of the paper is available, of course, at the HERCA website if you want to read the whole paper, because I will, in this short presentation, only be able to touch upon some of the main messages from this paper. And the paper builds on the experience from the regulators in these European countries, from practical use of implementation of the recommendations in our legislative systems. So the HERCA paper consists of these sections. I will not go into those, all of them in detail, but I will highlight some of them. And for instance, there is, we believe that the system of radiation protection is a robust one, and it, of course, needs to continue to be a robust science-based system. That's important to us as regulator, but also important for the general trustworthiness of the system as such. And having said that, we believe that there's still room for further clarification and further guidance in order for the system to be even better understood among different stakeholders. And also, for instance, to make further clarity about the different approaches where the RP system is used for intentional exposures, such as in the medical field, from unintentional exposure situations that we find in a number of other different scenarios. And we do not propose any dramatic changes to the system, but fine-tuning is definitely possible, and above all, further guidance on how to apply the general principles and what are the background for the different approaches within the system. So I guess if there's one takeaway that I would hope that you would remember from this presentation, it is that we believe that in order to, when changes are proposed for the RP system, they should undergo a regulatory impact assessment prior to being issued. And that, of course, is to ensure that the changes the benefits of the changes outweigh any risks or consequences that you might find by the way of having to have changes in the regulatory systems in the different countries. So, of course, HERCA is very much ready to join forces with the ICRP in performing these regulatory impact assessments and do our best to bring to the table the consequences that we might see in changes that could be proposed. And of course, the system as such is complex, and that poses some challenges in transferring it to the regulatory field. So, as I've said before, there's a room for further guidance. For instance, we all know that there are a variety of different reference levels. It has been mentioned already today earlier, and those differences might make the system a bit difficult to understand sometimes, and also further guidance might help us to get a harmonized implementation of the system so that it's done more in the same way all over the world. And we also see that the underlying principles and the differences between intentional and unintentional exposure is important to further clarify in such guidance. One issue that we have identified that could be further addressed is the radon issue. And For example, the new dose conversion factors that were adopted was one example of where a regulatory impact assessment would have been beneficial in order to further have a heads up on what the changes might mean to the regulatory system and avoid some confusion that have been caused by this. So we also believe that the radon in workplaces is an area where we have different approaches, and it might benefit from having more common understandings of the approaches that are used for setting reference levels, for instance. We also believe that there's a need to follow up on persons who have received high doses of radiation, should it be in the workplace or in the homes, to make sure that we have adequate protection of persons receiving high doses of radon. And a further area, which has also been mentioned by several persons already today, is the area of communication, where we would think that it's important to have further clarity so that there will be a more common understanding in what are the main features of the system, what are the differences in different exposure situations, and how could it be applied. And also, we think that comparing exposures with background exposures, or comparing exposure of radiation with other types of exposure situations, such as in exposures of chemicals and etc., might help to put the radiation risks in perspective. I think that's also one important takeaway from HERCA that we would like to bring to the table here. And last but not least, we see a merit in further distinguishing between what is science and what is value judgments, and also to have further clarity of where the uncertainties are. We think that that might help the understanding of the system as such. We also have identified a few other issues in our paper, for instance, to look further into all the new technologies that we find coming up in the medical field and how to deal with the radiation protection of those technologies, how to assess the environmental risks, and maybe to see whether there can be some good findings from other fields that could be helpful in our development of those environmental assessments. Education and training, of course, always very important. And lastly, also to say that we think that the effects on responders in emergency situations could be further clarified. For instance, where to use the prior informed consent in early and mid and intermediate phases of an emergency. But as I said in the beginning, if you're interested, the whole paper is available if you would like to read some more about this. And with that, I think I will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Nina. I will now pass the floor to Chris.
Thanks, Carla. Our next speaker is Andreas Meyer. He comes from SSK, which is the German Commission on Radiological Protection, presenting on proposals for the revision of the ICRP Recommendation 103. So, Andreas, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak about our proposal for the revision of ICRP Recommendation 103. I'm a member of a working group from SSK, and you can see the names on the lower part of this on the graph. So, for example, Joachim Brecko or Rolf Michel, Annette Röttger, or also Frido Zölzer, whose members also here in the auditorium today are members of this working group. First, some words on the German Commission on Radiological Protection, SSK. It advises the Federal Ministry on issues of protection against threats caused by ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. And it is consisting of the main commission, there you can see the picture on the right-hand side, and also an emergency task force, which is meeting in the event of a nuclear or radiological event. Then there are several specific committees, 7, and many more working groups dealing with specialized topics, and I'm also a member of one of these working groups, as I mentioned, and I'm also giving this talk on behalf of one of these working groups. First, some more general or conceptual aspects where we think that there might be discussion worth in the future. For the LNT model. So the LNT is one of the most basic concepts used in the field of radiological protection, but it's rather a mechanistics model than the description of the biological reality. Single biological effects can show a nonlinear behavior, for example, survival curves or many others, but it is a useful tool for radiological protection, and therefore it's not contradictory to use the LNT model, even if the single biological effects might be not linear, but it's not the description of a biological working mechanism, but useful tool for radiological protection. And we recommend to emphasize this fact in the future more. For the understanding of the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor, this concept is quite difficult to understand and rather a source of confusion than of transparency. And also the biological justification is weak and there are huge uncertainties, and therefore there are a lot of controversial discussions ongoing in this field. And we recommend to adapt it or to abolition it. In the case of an adaptation of the DDREF, then all parameters integrated in the damage quantification, meaning the detriment, should be modified in our suggestion. The detriment is a very useful tool for damage quantification, as it not only includes lethality, but also the quality of life factors. But this detriment is yet reasonably complex. And for example, there are similar models used in environmental protection, industrial safety, like the disability adjusted life year model, the DALI, where also the impairment of life is included in addition to mortality. And if you're looking at these models, then always the lethality is one of the main parameters in damage quantification. And therefore, we suggest to discuss if this model needs to be that detailed or if it can be simplified. For the weighting factors, the radiation weighting factors are based on RBE studies, so on experiments for one part, but they, in the end, are normatively defined. And there are some indications from RBE studies where we suggest that there might be a review needed for the tissue weighting, for the radiation weighting factors, especially for alpha irradiation if the value of 20 reflects the risk in an appropriate way. For the tissue weighting factors, there is especially this problem for the skin, where results from the lifespan study cohort showed that there might be no radiation-induced skin cancer below a value of 0.5 gray. And also the lethality for skin is very low, for skin cancer is very low, therefore the detriment is also very low, and we suggest that there might be a review needed. We also see no indication for sex-specific radiation susceptibility, but there are some indications, some studies where there might be some sex-specific differences in the cancer induction in different organ systems, which needs to be investigated in the future. For the practicability and the realism, we suggest that the whole system should be reviewed if simplifications are possible. But there should only be adaptations of the system if this improves the whole system. Also, an unnecessary conservatism should be avoided, and there needs to be a balance between the continuity and the adaptation to new evidence due to scientific findings. From this more general, I will come to some more individual aspects. So for cardiovascular diseases, studies suggest that it's inconclusive whether it's stochastic or deterministic effects, and also the dose-effect relationship is inconclusive. This is due to a lack of experimental data, as there are not many animal or cell culture models, and therefore the integration in the current system of radiological protection is non-specific. In the last few years, the dose due to medical applications or medical procedures is rising for the general population. This is due to improvements in the technology and the new medical procedures which are in the clinics. And for those new medical procedures, there should always be a risk-benefit evaluation before it is introduced in the clinics, and this should be done for the users and for the patients. And ICRP should formulate consistent and standardized criteria for these new procedures before they're introduced in the clinics, based on justification, optimization, and dose reduction. For ethical aspects, since several years, ethical aspects are coming more and more into the discussion, and this culminated in ICRP publication 138. And when we suggest also when discussing in specific areas, for example, integration of artificial intelligence, then it should always be referred to this ICRP 138 as the backbone. And nevertheless, when discussing about ethical aspects beside the technological or scientific aspects, then the transparency and the coherence should be maintained. For occupationally exposed persons, we suggest to harmonize the terminologies and the concepts for the deduction of the limits, and also to review the justification for the 5-year limit of 100 millisievert. The scientific evidence of the tolerable risk, which is the basic concept, might not have changed, but what is considered in the general public as tolerable risk has. And therefore, we suggest to discuss this in the future. For the general population, there are huge uncertainties for these low doses in dose assessment. And there should always be the potential benefit or disadvantages if the limit is reduced. Nevertheless, we suggest to keep this 1 millisievert per year. And also for radon, I'm not the first mentioning this today, there were several studies which then changed the dose conversion and eventually the dose conversion factors. And we suggest to reevaluate this on the new results from the Wismut cohort and also the pooled uranium miner study. Then there should be consensus of recommendations for dose coefficients, as there are huge uncertainties between the dosimetric and the epidemiologic approach. And also, one could discuss if the recommendation should be based on activity concentrations, which are directly measurable, instead of dose values where you have huge uncertainties when you are calculating them. So with this, I come to the conclusion. So the current system of radiological protection has proven its worth and also the robustness in the practical application. Nevertheless, it must be adapted to changes in the science and in society. And a lot of SSK recommendations in the past support the ICRP system, but some recommendations see reasonable evidence for additions, extensions, or modifications of the existing system. And there's always balance needed between conservatism and realism, individualization and resilience, and also continuity versus adaptation to new evidence. And everything I was presenting today will also, and much more, will be published after the main commission of SSK agreed to the final version, and then it will be also translated into English, which might be more helpful for most of the audience. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andreas. SSK has been very busy, clearly, with lots of good ideas. Just a reminder to the audience that about 20 minutes from now we'll be taking questions, so prepare yourself. But next up is Juan Carlos Lentillo. He is the president of CSN, which is the Spanish Nuclear Regulatory Authority, and will be speaking on communication of radiation protection issues. Juan Carlos, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chris. I would like to thank the ICRP for your kind invitation. I will focus my presentation on the importance of communication in the radiological protection system. This is what I intend to cover, but just to clarify the expectations, please don't consider that I will provide any new idea or any new concept. On the opposite, I will reiterate the so very well-known concepts under communication. And as you know, reiteration is a very good tool for learning, but also for communication. Well, I will frame my presentation, of course, under the process already opened by the ICRP for the review and revision of the radiological protection system, as established in the ICRP 103. And of course, in particular, the reflection of the paper published in 2021 by the ICRP on keeping the ICRP recommendations fit for purpose, which was very welcome. And of course, I will provide mainly or particularly the viewpoint of the regulators. In this regard, the Spanish Nuclear Safety Council is part of ERCA, and we participated and cooperated for the preparation of the reflections document that has already been summarized by Nina Cromier. Likewise, ICRP, ERCA basically emphasizes the need for simplification and clarification of the system, while also providing additional guidance or additional development for the justification and optimization, also for additional guidance in the area of radon issues, and to improve communication of the system, which is, as I mentioned before, the focus of my presentation, and I would like to elaborate a little bit more in this topic, in this area. Allow me to share some reflections or elements that, in our view, regulators need to be considered for improving communication. They are, in fact, drivers for the future. Firstly, as you well know, regulators need to interact, need to engage with the general public, but this is necessary, but at the same time, very difficult. In general, a regulator needs to build strong and very fluent relationships and communications with all relevant stakeholders, administration, professional societies, etc. And we are very used to post news on achievements, news on incidents, and for doing that we use our web pages, the social media platforms, etc., with the idea to keep the public informed. These posts are usually or generally consulted mainly by other professionals, either from the licensees or by journalists, especially when an incident occurs or when something is really of public interest. For that purpose, we need to engage with us specialized human resources, I mean experts in communication, with the idea to help us in providing content in order to keep our channel a reference for the society when it looks for information. As an example, when an emergency occurs, media need information, need to inform, but to inform, they need information. And they look for this information through, let's say, expert speakers, they need explanations, guidance, etc. And in my view, in our view, this is a very good chance for the regulators and for the radiation protection professionals to provide reliable information. In these situations, it's usually a challenge for the regulators and for other authorities to get our voices really prevail among the noise which is produced by the high multiplicity of media and social networks. This is, in the end, directly linked to the credibility, to the confidence, to the trustability of the regulators or the authorities, which at the same time depends on many factors. And as you well know, this needs to be built well in advance. In that context, one of the aspects that is becoming more and more important nowadays is the need for the clarity and simplicity of the messages that we elaborate. And as you know, some current platforms only admit very short messages with a very limited number of characters. And on the other hand, the public is becoming more and more used to shorter explanations. This is, in the end, a very difficult equation that we need to solve. While providing reliable and clear information, we need that this information is provided through ways which are short and which are simple. As you well know, it has been stated several times this morning, the current system of radiological protection is based on a very robust scientific foundation as well as ethical principles, although it's obvious that there is still some room for improvement as we have progress in the scientific knowledge. However, it is generally also admitted that the complexity of the system makes it very difficult to be implemented, even for professionals of the radiation protection. This morning there was a question about this issue. In some areas, even some professionals in this field need more specialized advice for the implementation. That means that it is even much more difficult to be communicated to the public, especially to the general public. As you well know, especially is very complex to address a community that lives very far from, for example, a nuclear disaster and try to advise them of non-taking AK pills, while there are what I could say pseudo-experts who are recommending exactly the opposite based on the conservative approach. In this area, I would like to simply share with you that we all have seen during the last years how some negationists have, let's say, complicated the vaccination process in some countries for the COVID-19. Well, it is very clear in the end that the efficiency of the radiation protection system depends very much on its understandability, on its, let's say, usability, and finally on its communicability. That means the capacity to elaborate short, simple, clear messages whose rationale is easy to be understood and then easy to be even followed by the public. Consequently, we think that the ICRP has a challenge. The radiation protection community, in general speaking, has a challenge to review the system, while keeping its scientific robustness, making it more communications friendly. Looking at the way forward, you know that the ICRP has already initiated the issue, addressed the issue of communications and stakeholder involvement as one of the overarching considerations described in the document mentioned before. Even more, the ICRP has already introduced the very interesting concept of co-expertise process, which is based on the involvement and empowerment of stakeholders, and which is linked to the radiation protection culture. And in our view, this is a very good foundation for continuing, growing, and refining the communication system around the technical one. Well, regulators, as the CSM, would like to recognize and praise the ICRP for this initiative. And we believe that the ongoing efforts for simplification and clarification will definitely contribute to better enhanced communicability of the system. And just to finish, allow me to share with you some final considerations from the pure view of the communication. As said, while radiation protection system is robust and is based on a very strict, very robust scientific foundation, occasionally we focus our communication mainly on what it is not totally known, on uncertainties rather than certainties. This is typically what happens with the very low dose range. However, for regulators, it's very important to base our actions on certainties and at the same time explain our actions, including in a transparent way what is not really 100% known. That means the uncertainties. This is the case, for example, of the LNT, which is very difficult for a regulator to explain to the general public. In the end, we need to respond to the question, what is safe, what is not safe? And we need to be very clear in that. Then my last reflection with you is that we need a specialized advice, we need a specialized support when we prepare the new system in order to be sure that it will be much easier to be understood. Thank you so much. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. It's great to see a lot of good ideas in there. Personally, I really share the idea that the system has to be more easily communicated so it can be more understood around the world, both by those who implement it and those who benefit from it. So the last speaker in our session is Peter Johnson. Peter, you've met already today if you were here in the morning, but he is Director of Radiation Transport and Waste Safety at the IAEA. He's here to speak about the need for stability in the RP system. Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks, Chris. It's a great pleasure to be here in Vancouver, and I thank the ICRP for inviting me to be part of this session. This presentation is the result of work by myself and Miroslav Pinak, who's the head of the Radiation Safety and Monitoring section within my division. So I'm going to talk about the need for stability in the radiation protection system, and I'm going to try and explain to you why I make that case. So, next slide.
The green arrow should do it. The green arrow at the top should do it. The green arrow.
Green arrow.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. Very green. Okay. So, the International Atomic Energy Agency was established in 1957 as a United Nations specialist agency to promote the peaceful use of nuclear technology. And under its statute, it has the responsibility to generate standards for the safety, protection of health and minimisation of danger to life and property, and for the application of those standards. I still haven't got it. Green arrow. So, the IAEA and the ICRP have a long-standing collaboration. We have an agreement from 2014, but that's not its first agreement. We work together in the Interagency Committee for Radiation Safety, which is a group of international organisations that get together to try and come up with a common story about how radiation protection works. ICRP is an observer on the Radiation Safety Standards Committee and other relevant standards committees, and indeed the IAEA is a part of ICRP committees, and IAEA is a member of the ICRP Special Liaison Organisations Group, and we recently held a topical session during the Radiation Safety Standards Committee on the topic of the revision of the radiation protection system. So, ICRP 103 is a key document for the IAEA in that it forms, in fact, the basis for General Safety Requirement Part 3. GSR Part 3 is otherwise known as the International Basic Safety Standards, and this is a document which is designed to be a regulatory document, and it is in fact the basis of the national legislation for radiation protection for very many countries around the world. And so it's a very important international document. And it's not only an IAEA document, but it's also formally endorsed by a range of other international organisations. So, the thesis of my talk is that the stability of the radiation protection system is fundamentally important. So, the IAEA works with member states to establish effective regulatory systems so that those member states can make use of nuclear and radiation technologies. So, by undertaking this activity, the IAEA not only contributes to building a harmonised system worldwide, but also through the collection of feedback in that process looks to the future improvement of the system. Now, this process requires considerable human and financial resources, and so diverting resources from this task needs to be justified by and driven by a clear and significant benefit that would necessarily mean that other work would need to be deferred. And as an example of that, we have at the moment around 25 member states that have no effective regulatory system whatsoever. We believe that the system of radiation protection that we have at the present time is robust, fit for purpose, and has performed well. So, the IAEA is focusing on assisting its member states in applying the current radiation protection system based on ICRP Publication 103, and we believe that there's no particular reason at the moment to not continue to implement that system. IAEA also works on filling in the gaps in its safety guidance publication series where they exist by preparing additional safety guidance addressing those gaps. Have I got out of sync? Okay. So, we recognise that there are challenges within the system of radiation protection, and but we see that, in fact, many of our member states have more difficulty in implementing the safety standards that exist rather than the gaps in the system that we identify. So, examples of difficulties that we see identified are in fact with the three exposure situations, planned, emergency and existing, and with the three categories of exposure, members of the public, workers and patients. We see challenges with implementation of justification and optimisation, and consistent protection strategies for existing exposure situations. Many member states believe that the system of radiation protection has become too complex. The IAEA recognises that there is difficulties with the clarity and consistency of the system of radiation protection, and there would be some advantages in better communication of the system, but in doing that, we believe that keeping the pillars of the system intact is a necessity. So both clarity and consistency could be improved while more guidance and implementation could be added rather than a need to revisit the system itself. So, we would welcome more clarity and consistency in the system of radiation protection, and through discussions within the Secretariat, some of the proposals in the ICRP paper have been observed not to be internally consistent. I'm not going to focus on that. We see the scientific fundamentals of the contemporary radiation protection system remain well formulated. There are some difficulties and misunderstandings in the implementation, but this is mostly a matter of communication and explanation. We see changes in the current radiation protection system could bring more clarity, and IAA's current activities focus on enhancing involvement in the next generation of professionals, health physics and regulators who will shape the radiation protection field for the future. So in summary, the radiation protection system is robust, fit for purpose, and has performed well. The full set of IAA safety requirements has only recently been completed. The focus of the IAA is on its implementation. Many member states are still implementing the current system of radiation protection, and so the stability of the system is of paramount importance. IAA member states have challenges implementing the system of radiation protection rather than with the radiation protection system itself. Experience is showing that clarity and consistency, as well as the eventual simplification, is an issue rather than changing the pillars of the radiation protection system. It's more important to keep the safety standards stable for their credibility and public acceptance. And the IAA is quite happy to have a conversation about changes to the radiation protection system, but ultimately any changes to the radiation protection system need to be justified because the cost of making changes to the radiation protection system is very significant, and there needs to be a demonstrated overall net benefit to justify the system change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your presentation. And now I hand the microphone back to Carla for the Q&A period.
Thank you, Chris. So many thanks to all presenters. They providing us with the overviews of ideas, opinions, thoughts of some stakeholders, important stakeholders, I think. They use the system, current system of radiological protection. And also, thank you for keeping the time. And so we have, finally, we have time for questions. I think it's important that you have this opportunity to pose some questions for clarification. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm Thierry Schneider, the chair of Committee 4 of ICRP. All the speakers provided very interesting topics, and there is a large spectrum of elements which cover all the system of radiological protection. So I will not go in detail of some of them. I have just 2 points which have been emphasized by several of you. The first one is on education and training. And Werner Rühm presented the call for action from ICRP. How you see the role of ICRP or the cooperation with your organization in this topic? And the same could be considered for communication. Is it specifically a role for ICRP, or do you see a cooperation in this domain with regard to stakeholder involvement and communication, and including the radiological protection culture?
Thank you, Thierry. So, some reactions? Yeah, Bernard, please.
Yeah. Well, probably, Thierry, you well observed that my last sentence was exactly on this field, education and training. In fact, there is 2 points behind your question. First is about the system. I think many of us explain that sometimes it's quite complex, and when it is complex, it's quite difficult to explain to the professional or to the public. So it's the first, I think it's a material, where it's a system. The second point is who is in charge of education and training. As well mentioned, as you know, IRPA has a role to play, for example, but also for each Congress we have the opportunity to organize education, we have to organize training courses, and of course it's very important to have this opportunity when we organize a Congress to provide some elements. Of course, we try also through the AEA initiative also on education and training. I will participate in a consultancy meeting in 10 days in Vienna on this topic. And I would like just to mention the fact that on behalf of IRPA, I will be very proud if we can help for this towards the professionals, because we have clearly a role to play when I mentioned the fact that we have the opportunity to take feedback experience from the field. It's also an opportunity to provide element and explanation when it is possible, but not alone. I believe about, for example, when I launched an initiative on radiation safety culture, I said in healthcare, I say it's not only the problem of IRPA, it's a problem of all organizations, and that's why I have the opportunity to organize this with WHO, the AEA, IOMP, and so on. So probably it's not the topic of one organization, but probably we have to think for each organization what is the role, and clearly for IRPA it's toward professionals.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can continue. Yeah, Juan Carlos.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if it is working or not. Apparently, no. Please, it is working now.
Yes,
okay, thank you. Yeah, as far as communication is concerned, I think that we all have some responsibility in the communication of the system. While on one hand, we have the developers of the system, in this case the ICRP, maybe the IAEA also, and of course the implementers of the system. Definitely at national level we have radiation protection specialists, we have regulators who have a special responsibility for us. What I would like to reiterate is that the idea is not to simplify the system just for communication. The system should have to be as complex as needed, but what we need is to develop a communication strategy which is really simple, the communication strategy as such, and that try to translate difficult concepts into simple, let's say, ideas to be communicated to the public. I think this is really necessary, and this is why we are very supportive of involving from the very beginning experts in communication, specialist personnel in communication, to help developing the system with this idea. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Nina, please.
Yes, thank you. Juan Carlos touched upon a number of things that I was intending to say as well. That, of course, the ICRP has a role in communication, but not alone. It has to work through other key stakeholders. And here I think that, for instance, the regulators are a group that could further communicate with the general public, as could other organizations work through their different channels. So yes, our ICRP definitely has a role, but it has to do it together with other organizations to spread the message, and we all need to sort of chip in to have this communication work. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina. And Peter?
Yeah, a couple of things. The first one is every country has to have its own education and training strategy, and the agency has a program to assist with that called Eduta. So you can ask for an Eduta mission. Also, there's a system of PGEC programs around the world. There are 6 of them in the 6 languages of the UN. And these training programs where you can send people along for a 6-month course to be trained if you don't have a national training program in your own country. So that's another possibility.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So we have another questions. Yes, you. I don't see who was first, but yeah, okay. Okay, so please, you have a floor. Sorry.
Closer to the mic.
Could you pick
It's,
closer? Does it work?
No.
no.
No, microphone's
No,
not
no,
working.
Maybe someone's coming right now.
All right, let me just see if this works. This is much better.
Okay.
Mary Duarte, I'm the Director of RAD Safety for Ontario Power Generation. I've heard some very good discussions along the system, and it's being founded on good pillars. But I've also heard common themes around improvements that are required, inconsistencies, some issues around even the units, et cetera, not being well understood. My question is, what are we doing with those themes, with that information? Who's pulling all of that together? And then the desire, the bias for action to drive continuous improvement.
Okay, thank you. Somebody is feeling like... yeah.
Well, as I mentioned before, we collect all the feedback we get, not just the positive feedback, also the negative feedback. And then we mirror this to the task groups, if the task groups on certain topics already exist. I mean, we heard, for example, today exposure situations, categories of exposures and critical issue. We just have initiated a task group on that. Yeah? So we try to reflect all the comments. And so please submit your comments and then let us know. And we will deal with it and make sure that they will be addressed in the corresponding task groups. I'm not so sure, I cannot guarantee that you are happy how ICRP will do that to address all the issues, but at least you can be assured that we take all the feedback seriously and consider it.
So if I understand correctly, the feedback is filtered to the various task groups, and then as part of their work, they would address that.
I don't like the word filtered, because this
passed,
sounds as if we
communicated
filter
to-
out what we don't. No, they are directed
To
and,
the
and
various
transferred to the task groups, yeah.
Got it. Thank
And
you
also
so much.
discussed in the main commission, of course, and the committees.
Thank you.
Just a very short comment. With IRPA, when we have the occasion to have feedback from the different associated society and from different professionals, we don't try to have a consensus. We just try to have, we receive many answers. The majority said that, the other said so. The idea is to provide, we try to provide all elements and not try to focus on to say, well, there is only one voice.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we will continue with another question.
Yeah,
Simon?
thank you very much. Simon Boofer from the UK Health Security Agency and ICRP. So it's quite a specific question to the colleague from SSK. You said the SSK found no indication that sex is a modifier of cancer risk. And that seems to be somewhat contrasting with what we heard from IRPA, that they would support the consideration of age and sex in the calculation of effective dose. So perhaps you could explain the reasoning behind that statement you made. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Reaction? Andreas?
So, okay, sorry, I did not understand it in total. So, for the differences between the different sexes, I'm also not the absolute expert in this field. As far as I know it, then there is not, for radiation susceptibility, there are not huge uncertainties, of course, but there's not definite answer that there are sex-specific differences, and so we wrote it this way that it's not, there's no indication for it, only for specific cancer entities.
May I add that Simon is heading a task group on individualization, individual susceptibility of radiation-induced effects. So this is also a topic we as ICRP are looking at it very seriously.
Okay, thank you. So next question, I think, I don't know, yeah, please.
My name is Mahesh. I'm the ICRP committee number 3 member, and I'm from US. The question is, a lot of common theme, but the main thing is, many of you might not like what I'm saying regarding effective dose. The effective dose term is widely used outside the radiation protection people. It's used by physicians, and it's kind of make it, because doctors likes one simple number, they use the effective dose, and it's out there. So my concern, or at least recommendation for the ICRP, when we are evaluating new, to be very careful to not to dislodge what is already widely used, and if you had to dislodge and you replace it with a better term, it has to take in some buy-in from the users, such as the physicians and the general public. So I know, like a lot of my colleagues, and even I don't like the effective dose term, but it has been out of the bag, and it has been widely used, and it's easy to communicate for the physicians who don't understand all the complexity of the radiation risks. So I just want to keep that in the mind when we are discussing about simplifying or changing the concept of effective dose, or using with a different unit such as individual risk, individual benefits. So we have to be very careful, because that's already used, and if you introduce something else, the chances of that getting accepted becomes more difficult, and it's going to only introduce more confusion to the people. I'm talking about not the radiation protection personnels, but to outside, the physicians and the general public, the journalists, and so forth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It was more the comment and message to ICRP. Okay, thank you. Okay, so last question, please.
First of all, thank you for the fantastic presentations. My name is Carmen Tiano. I'm the Director of Aux Services for the Ontario Building Trades. Ontario is the heartland of nuclear in Canada. Almost what my friend just said. In the last couple of years, there's been, the public has actually changed its views on nuclear to positive. My concern is that if there is any changes to radiation protection, we may lose the capital that we have. So it's more of a comment that what we have in place is actually moving us to energy security, new builds in Ontario. So I'm concerned if we make any radical changes, we may lose the positive support that we have. So almost like what my friend said about what we know from 50, 60 years, we need to tread lightly, because if we do anything, there may be unintended consequences. I don't know how it's happening in the rest of the world, but I can see it positively shifting in Ontario for what it was even 3, 4 years ago. So whatever we do, let's just tread lightly. We know what's been said, and let's not put any new models in place that can really cause some unintended consequences.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Good point. So,
thank you. Just, I mean, I understand it's a comment, but I just want to react on the comment. Just to avoid misunderstanding, we do not propose any radical change, as you just might
I wasn't
have implied.
suggesting radical, but, but there is chatter that things may go down on an unintended consequence. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you, or for the questions, answers, reactions. So, and I think now it's time to close this session.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have very good timing. So thank you all of you.
Thanks to our chairs.
And,